Hello, my name is Dr. Dan Guerra, and I come to you from VerevMed, which stands for Verification of Evidence in Medical Sciences. We're an online web-based company which deals with clients who want to know more about the published scientific literature and get a complete appreciation of what is current in that literature as explained to them by scientists, both myself, I'm a lipid biochemist with a PhD, and my colleague who is a registered pharmacist. So together we provide this company. What I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to give you a brief overview of one particular investigation of the literature to give you an idea of the kinds of things we do. So we're going to talk about vitamin D. So vitamin D is not really a vitamin in the strict sense because we can make it ourselves. Sorry for the complexity of this slide here, but I am a biochemist, so I like to do this sort of thing. Simplest thing to say is that vitamin D actually comes from cholesterol, which we make in the body. Cholesterol is converted to the 7-dehydroform, and the 7-dehydroform ultimately is converted via UV light in the skin to the bioactive form of vitamin D, ultimately after an enzymatic reaction in the liver to 25-hydroxy-D. This is the most important metabolite in the body. I'm showing you this slide too because I want to show you that when you synthesize this vitamin yourself, that is when you're not supplementing it, there's a feedback regulation of this enzyme, it's D25-hydroxylase, so that you never build up toxic amounts of vitamin D. You only make as much as you need because when this builds up, it shuts down that enzyme. There's also a lot of catabolic pathways that can be used, and ultimately you can also make another bioactive form of it, which is a dihydroxylated form. Again, vitamin D is highly regulated because it is a hormone. It has a tremendous amount of effects in bone mineralization and also in the central nervous system, which sometimes acts as a transcription factor. So because of that, it's a highly regulated vitamin. So what does it do? As I said, it's a hormone. It requires binding proteins that carry it throughout the serum to target organs because it is a lipid. It's not water soluble. Its main claim to fame is that it's involved in bone growth, calcium phosphorus absorption. And as I said, it's also involved in the expression of genes in the central nervous system. What about D deficiency? Do we see it? It's not a common thing. It's clinically very rare, at least in the 21st century, and in most of the world, even in the non-developed world. And when you do get some kind of vitamin D deficiency, it's more like an insufficiency. So there was some argument that maybe we're getting occult insufficiency. That's the reason the vitamin D supplementation was being suggested. We're going to see now that maybe they're going to be pulling that recommendation back. What could contribute to deficiency or insufficiency? Dark skin. That has to do with the fact that dark skin, because it has melanin, will absorb some of that UV light to prevent that UV light from activating that dehydroform and making the active D3. Women who breastfeed can sometimes show a deficiency or insufficiency. Of course, lack of direct sunlight, not drinking fortified milk. Most milk is fortified with vitamin D. In fact, all milk in this country is, except for like soy milk. And even a lot of that is. And what happens if you get deficiencies? You get calcium deficiency. Some classical diseases that we're seeing, rickets, of course, was seen around the turn of the last century. My grandfather, an old Italian from Chicago, had actually rickets when he was a young boy, and he had to walk with a cane most of his adult life. So that was probably due to the lack of exposure to sunlight because of the late stages of the Industrial Revolution and growing in a northern city like Chicago. Osteomalacia, so that affects children. You really don't see it anymore, very rare, but can be found occasionally. Much more common is osteomalacia that's found in older people. The reason you see it in older people is because they get less sunlight exposure because they're more shut in. What happens with osteomalacia, of course, is you get brittle and deformed bones. So vitamin D, though, can also give you a toxicity. So there aren't many vitamins that actually be toxic, but the lipid-based vitamins can. Vitamin A is another very common one that shows hypervitaminosis. Vitamin D is within that category. What it does when you get a toxicity is it raises blood calcium, and that then will cause stones and soft tissues, and also can harden blood vessels, and that can lead to all kinds of problems, including morbidity and mortality. Here are a few papers I wanted to talk about real briefly with you. One is in the British Medical Journal, published just recently. You can see the citation up there. What they were looking at was, at the endpoint was, is this vitamin D supplementation act beneficial by lowering the risk for upper respiratory tract infections. Basically, what this review article showed was that only if you're severely deficient in this serum form was there shown any positive effect. And in fact, there was no effect, basically non-significant, if you had normal levels of circulating active vitamin D. So that means that the participation of this study, this is a human cohort study, randomized controlled trials, it was not demonstrated the positive endpoint of lowering that risk for respiratory tract infections was really represented by supplementation with vitamin D. Second paper I want to talk about comes from the New England Journal, published just late last year. First of all, you have to know that it was only in 2011 when the Institutes of Medicine recommended an RDA value that was based on serum levels. Serum levels of D below 20 nanogram per mil, which comprises about 50 nanomole per liter. However, that recommendation is now under a lot of refutation. It may be a misrepresentation, and because of that, it may be leading to overdiagnosis of D deficiency and therefore inappropriate supplementation with vitamin D over the counter. And because this whole description of vitamin D levels was not including ideas of whether or not sunlight would mediate synthesis, of course we know it does, you already have a problem with that recommended level. Only people actually that have bona fide calcium disorder deficiencies, and this is again a very rare disorder, it does happen, but when you do have a calcium metabolic disorder, it must be diagnosed clinically before vitamin D can be considered for supplementation. Of course, your medical doctor has to do that diagnosis for you. Therefore, according to this review article, vitamin D supplementation likely does more harms than good in the general population because most people are not getting that very careful clinical evaluation. Last paper I'm going to talk about comes out of Switzerland in a journal called Pulse. Again, recent paper. They asked whether or not vitamin D helps in cardiovascular condition, particularly lowering blood pressure and decreasing atherosclerosis. The evidence from several randomized controlled trials is inconsistent. They do not support vitamin D supplementation, and therefore the conclusions you can draw from this paper is that D supplementation is ineffective in improving cardiovascular health, regardless of either the presence or absence of vitamin D deficiency. So they were actually measuring serum levels, and they did not see that vitamin D had a positive effect. So looking at these three papers, the summary of this, from looking at this body of literature and verifying this literature by examining it, it's suggested that supplementation with vitamin D is not generally recommended. So this is the kind of thing that you want to know more about, either as a clinician or as a client that's out there in the world thinking about vitamin D supplementation, that the current literature does not recommend supplementation, except under severe clinical reasons such as calcium insufficiency or maybe super low levels of vitamin D because of some other kind of ailment. Thank you very much. And remember, this comes from Vera Med, and my name is Dr. Dan Guerra. I enjoyed giving you this brief talk, and I will be back again soon. Look for me on YouTube and look for me on Twitter. Bye-bye.